This love in the Godhead, this, people call it intra-Trinitarian love. If God can be referred to as the Trinity, then it's love amongst the members of the Godhead, is perfect. And each one who is loved is lovely. It's not as if the Father says to the Son, frankly, you really are a hopeless case, but I love you anyway. The Son is perfectly lovely, and the Father's perfectly lovely, and they love each other perfectly. That's one way the Bible speaks of God's love. Another way is this: God's love can be cast in a kind of providential setting. God sends, we're told, His Son and His reign upon the just and upon the unjust. That is to say, it is providential and non-discriminating. It is an amoral love, not an immoral love, but an amoral love. He sustains both. In fact, in the Sermon on the Mount, Jesus can use that fact to say, if God can send His Son and His reign upon the just and the unjust, then you shouldn't make all these fine distinctions about who's your friend and who's your enemy, and only love your friends and hate your enemies. So there is a sense in which God's love can extend so generously to friend and foe alike. That's another context. Then another way that the Bible speaks of God's love is this. Sometimes it speaks of God's love in a kind of moral, inviting, commanding, yearning sense. So you find God addressing Israel in the Old Testament when the nation is particularly perverse, saying, "Turn, turn, why will you die? The Lord has no pleasure in the death of the wicked." He's that kind of God. He invites. And we'll discover here in a moment, God so loved the world. But there's a fourth kind. A fourth way of speaking. It's not a fourth kind of love. It's a fourth kind of speech, a fourth way of talking about God's love. Sometimes God's love is elective. It is choosing. It is frankly discriminating. It chooses one and not another. Jacob have I loved, but Esau have I hated. Very, very strong language. In the remarkable passages in Deuteronomy 7, Deuteronomy 10, that's the fifth book of the Old Testament, Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy. In chapters 7 and 10, God raises the rhetorical question, why did He choose the nation of Israel? He ticks off the possibilities. Because you're more numerous? Nope. Because you're more mighty? Nope. Because you're more righteous? Nope. He set His affection on you, the text says, because He loved you. That is, He loved you because He loved you. And in that context, this is why He chose Israel. It's not, and He loved all the other nations just the same. It's not, in the context, he set His affection on Israel as opposed to the other nations because He loved them. It's a sovereign choice. That's another way that the Bible speaks of God's love. And then there's still one more. Sometimes once God is in connection, in covenant, we've used that term, in a kind of family connection, an agreement connection with His own people, then His love becomes quite conditional. Thus, for example, the second last book of the Bible, a little one-page book called Jude, finds Jude, the half-brother of Jesus, writing, "Keep yourselves in the love of God," which shows that you might not keep yourself in the love of God. There's a moral dimension to it all. And indeed, there are a lot of passages in both Testaments where Jesus' love for us is in some sense conditional on our obedience. Even in the Ten Commandments, we saw words like this. He shows his mercy to generation after generation of those who love me and keep my commandments. So there is a context in which the Bible can speak of God's love in conditional terms. Now, do you see how subtle that is? Because you start asking, how do you put all this stuff together? But after you get over the first shock, you see that it can't be all that difficult, because we speak this way even of human love, don't we? I mean, I could say with a straight face, I love riding my motorcycle, I love woodwork, and I love my wife. But if I put all three together in the same sentence too often, my wife will not be pleased. Because they are really quite different contexts, aren't they? And they really have different weight. Or again, I can say, I believe, so help me God, I love my children unconditionally. I have a daughter in California who works with disadvantaged kids. If instead she became a hooker on the streets of LA, I think I'd love her anyway. She's my daughter. I love her unconditionally. I have a son who's a Marine. And if instead he started selling heroin on the streets of New York, I think I'd love him anyway. He's my son. I love him unconditionally. Yet in another context, when they were just kids, learning to drive, if I said to one of them, make sure you're home by midnight, if they weren't, they faced the wrath of Dad. In that sense, my love was quite conditional, thank you. It was conditional on obeying me and getting the flipping car home. In other words, there are different contexts where it's the same kids, the same dad, but the language it changes just a wee bit. Did you see? I don't think my unconditional love changed for them. There's a matrix in which that's true. Another matrix where there are agreements and family responsibilities, or in biblical terms, covenantal obligations, where God's wrath might well break out. There are contexts in which God's wrath is as wide as can be imagined. Some contexts in which it's rightly said to be amoral, and others where it's selective. So, people sometimes come along with cliches like, God loves everybody just the same. True or not true? And the answer is, yes. Because some of the passages that the Bible deploys language of love in really cast God's love as amoral. He sends his Son and his reign out of love upon the just and upon the unjust. He loves people just the same. But there are other contexts, like the fifth of the ones I mentioned, where it's dependent upon obedience. And still others where it's grounded in God's own sovereign selection. Do you see? You can't do anything to make God love you anymore. True or false? It depends on the passage, do you see? Because the Bible can use God's love language in different contexts in slightly different ways. In one sense, you want to affirm that absolutely. Because at the end of the day, you can't earn God's love. My kids don't earn my love by bringing the car back before midnight. I love them anyway. And yet, at the same time, there are different contexts in which God's love is spoken of. Be careful you do not make silly mistakes as you read the biblical text by taking one verse out of its context, universalizing it, and take no care to see the wonderful diversity of ways in which the Bible speaks of God's love.